let's talk about the adventures in Deadlands Dime Novels 1 to 3, which is Perdition's Daughter, Independence Day, and Night Train. Just give you some slightly better views of the covers. There we go. So I'll talk about the fiction in these separately. The Dime Novels were and are a really interesting concept, not completely out of line with what was going on in RPGs in the 90s, but basically the idea was, it's the age of print thematically. People are reading pot boilers or whatever, dime novels, cheap books. And so the first half of each of these is a novelette, a long short story, 30 to 40 pages. It's not very long at all, really. And the second half is an adventure. And in 90s RPG terms, these were all from the 90s, 96 to 97. You could say, well, actually that's not crazy as an idea because, in terms of what people are interested in. You might think, oh, that's a weird format. But RPGs were so full of fiction. Deadlands itself had opening fiction, but also it had like a whole in-character gazetteer in many books. I talked about that in my video on Deadlands, the Weird West. And so I don't think it's a particularly unusual thing that they're like, yeah, let's put this out. And some games, World of Darkness is the obvious one that comes to mind, were much heavier again. Just here's infinite amounts of fiction in the RPG books. And they all had tie-ins as well. World of Darkness is the obvious one, but Shadowrun, another very obvious one, I think. D&D, in some sense, probably the biggest of them all, still publishing R.A. Salvatore books, at least. So many books from the 80s onwards tied into RPGs. I'm trying to think if there are any. There's some that don't count licenses, like Star Wars D6, but I don't know if there is any really major RPG line that didn't put its hand to some fiction, because it's extra sales, it's buy-ins, it's people getting into different parts of it, and I think it's also probably in some of those more creator-run studios, not TSR perhaps. But it was also fun. They probably thought it was fun. And it's worth saying that the fiction here is in-house people. It's the fiction is by Shane Lacey Hensley, creator of Deadlands, Matt Forbeck, editor and long-term associate, and John Goff, again, early adventure writer and long-term associate. I think both of them still associated, as is Hensley, with Deadlands. Now, the adventures are sort of short adventures in some senses, compared to, some of the longer ones. I'm thinking about the Devil's Tower trilogy, Dead Presidents, things like that. There were some dime novels for 3 for Hell on Earth. There were 9 original ones. I think there's maybe in the Great White Games era, there's maybe some extra ones, but they're like 9 for Weird West, 3 for Hell on Earth. None for Lost Colony, but there was a novel, Banshee Screams. I think it was a novel rather than a novella. And then there have been some more recent ones. I don't know if the dime novels that came out for Deadlands Noir included adventures or not. But we're going to talk about the adventures today. The adventures are by Hal Mangold for Perdition's Daughter, by Chris Snyder, Matt Forbeck, and Shane Lacey Hensley for Independence Day. Hensley is credited with the original idea, and John Goff for Night Train. Night Train is maybe the most famous Deadlands adventure. It's the kind of convention adventure, and I think has a kind of, from what I understand, I don't say it's justly famous or justly deserved reputation, but other people would, of this kind of very fun, iconic adventure. To the point, it's the kind of thing that when they've run Kickstarters for Deadlands books, they're like, oh, there's going to be a new thing from John Goff, author of Night Train. Night Train actually also includes a short Great Rail Wars scenario, which was the miniatures game that they made for Weird West, and which maybe most significantly became the basis of, because it has some Deadlands stats but is simplified down from Deadlands and slightly different as well, it became the basis of Savage Worlds, which is a less weird and crinkly game than Deadlands Classic was. Of course, I think that's an advantage, that it's weird and crinkly. So the situations are, one, it's Christmas and there's a cult, and the heroes are out to find the son of someone who's missing, this missing son of someone who's gone and joined the cult. And the cult is obviously weird, and that's the Christmas special cover. Father Christmas and reindeer do not appear. This is a lie. The second follows the same main character, Ronan Lynch. They all do, basically. And he is in Dodge City, and it's Independence Day, and there's a murder spree. Dodge City, being in Kansas, is actually in the disputed lands between the Confederacy and the Union in Deadlands. And he teams up with Wyatt Earp and Hank Ketchum, the one-eyed Texas Ranger, to find out who this weird serial killer is. And finally, Night Train, again about Ronan, and this is about a train that goes around places, and everyone where the train passes die, because there's vampires. It's full of vampires. And the strength of all the adventures, let's just say this, the strength of all the adventures is that they are very strong concept monsters and concept situations. One is you have to investigate a cult, and it has a dark witch, dark magician lady who sucks the energy out of people. That's a very good pulp idea in terms of, these are dime novels, they are pulpy adventures, as Deadlands generally should be, and that really hits that. Again, it's a very Deadlandsy one, but the Butcher, for an iconic villain of Independence Day, is a surgeon being possessed by his cursed scalpel. And this links all back to the Battle of Gettysburg and the death there as the reckoning started, etc. And Night Train is vampires on a train going around, like vampires riding a steam train, so they can go and feed places by night. These are all strong ideas, and they all work at that level. What you find in execution is much more variable, and it's interesting, partly because you see a game in development and in flux. This is the same year. This is one of the first products that comes out with the book, and the adventure doesn't actually have XP. It doesn't have bounty listed. Now, bounty itself evolves over time, and you have adventures giving people poker chips directly, either the fate chips, and that's a realization that fate chips are always fungible, whereas bounty points are not. They are just XP. And this is the thing I talked about in my main video on Deadlands and The Quick and the Dead, is that the XP system is one of these things that, like a lot of trad games from the 90s, doesn't really work in terms of creating a normal engine for informing player behaviour and decisions. Because players are like, they just get XP randomly at points, or it's for doing plot things. There's no sense of player agency in how you find XP and do XP. And there are ways you could fix that, but I think it's something you can see here. You even have an adventure that doesn't give any. You have others that, Night Train, which is a good adventure, I'll say up front, I enjoy it, does have a couple of particularly bad examples of, like, where John Goff has been told you have to have 4 bounty per scene or chapter. And in the first chapter, they're all for finding clues, and that's actually quite good. Learn the crime occurred yesterday. Discover the station master fought back unsuccessfully. Learn the attacker came from and left by a train. Examine the station master's body and determine the cause of death. Then for chapter 2, it's learn about McBride's disappearance. That's the town marshal, and accept the deputy marshal's offer. So you get 1 for learning about the missing guy, and then 3 for accepting the deputy's offer, which is just for advancing the plot. Here's a reward. And I guess that's each, and I think that sort of highlights the fact that you can tell not everything is fully fixed or sorted. There's also 2 things that come up from reading these adventures, and I'll say a bit more about the individual adventures, but just to sum up, a high-level issue, you've got strong situations, but the execution is really mixed. So not just is there a few confusing, mucky bits, but also you have, and this was most pointed, I think, though it's somewhat true in the first 2, The third Night Train is slightly more consistent, though it still has some of this. It's that because you have to do the story and the plot, and so things are just generally going to happen, you sometimes get quite open parts of the game. And I'm thinking here in Perdition's Daughter that when you so chapter 3, the Church of the Holy Flame, you could go, it assumes you might scout it by day or by night, and gives who might be on watch and who's where and how they'll react if you turn up. And this actually all, and the one time during the day when they're all going to be in the church, this is all very strong actually. This is a really strong section, and in this adventure, the best part of the adventure I think is, because there really is a thing of like, okay, you can tell this has been played, you can tell the writer, Hal Mangold, who's written, you may know from other adventures written over time, he has grasped that you need to tell the DM, the marshal, this stuff so they can run it. It shows both experience in running it and, or at least running parts of it perhaps, but also some sense of like, there is a job in communicating this to the DM. Great. So, you find out about the weird church. There's a map. Another good thing, generally speaking, is, for instance, there's a map of the compound and the buildings, and you simply have a map of Derry's Ford, and with a key, which is all fairly efficiently communicated. So yeah, that's good. That's another strength. But when you're then having to deal with the cult, and this actually the ambush, this map is basically fine. The map is not the problem. A particularly interesting thing you realise is that you're told that you're pursuing them and you can see them over the horizon. The cult moving because they're going to the place of ritual where she's going to suck out all their life. They've abandoned their compound and they're going there, and you're pursuing them, but you can't catch them. And there are like obstacles along the way, but it's just simply described as they'll occasionally see them if they roll the right dice over the horizon or whatever. And what you realise here is, well, this is about the cinematic effect. It is forcing an experience on the players. And you could say, well, who cares if the players enjoy it? But here's the problem. What if the players, for some reason, can circumvent that? And I'm thinking, for instance, this could be your first adventure. It was, it may have been even the first adventure released for Deadlands, so fair enough. But even so, steam wagons are a core book item that you could technically start with, because you start with one gizmo if you're a mad scientist. But what if there is some reason you could have to catch up quickly? Now you could say, well, the DM's job is just to stop them doing that, but that's exactly the problem. That's bad. It's removing player agency. It's removing the fact that what players do matter. It's forcing your story on the players. But that is a section where just that has to happen, because there has to be a showdown during the ritual where everyone's going crazy and there's this cool pulp scene that's like almost Hammer-esque. And there's a few examples like that. There's certainly sections in Independence Day where you're like, oh, you can investigate it. It is suggested you might be able to catch the butcher at different points rather than in the finale, but it's written towards the finale. It gives some guidance towards everything else. There is some sense in which, and maybe that's just like, this is the most likely path. And that's something where the format, you've got 30 pages and they are digest pages to communicate all this. You can see that some of it might be format, but I think when talking about very good D&D adventures by Bruce Cordell, it's something I point out that sometimes you can tell he's under instructions to make this a bit flatter and more linear and simpler than his instinct is to. And he gives hints sometimes of like, actually, maybe you could do this, or these are other things. And there's sometimes it's active screw-ups and forcing players to do stuff that isn't fun, like that. Or like saying all the XP comes from accepting the job, otherwise you don't get XP. And you're like, well, yeah, fair enough, but that's itself that's a very heavy-handed lever, isn't it? Rather than the players being interested in something. Or in this one, it's that though there is a sense, oh, well, you're investigating who's doing it, you might be able to, it does say, you might be able to stop it without more than one murder happening. And I think there's 3 scripted, as it were, but like, well, that's fine, you understand, but maybe that's the limitations pressing down. The other critique to offer, like I say, so big good things are good concepts and some very good gazetteers and descriptions of towns. which frankly I think what struck me about this night train is it does give some very good advice about you might want to seed the idea that whole towns are, you know, disappear or whatever, whole small towns, you know. But I was thinking, actually, why not start your campaign in Varney Flats? If you're in Kansas anyway, start it in Varney Flats. Have them know Marshall McBride, have them know the Barlow station master, and then have them, you know, have a timetable, know when the night train is coming through that area, and yeah, or, you know, something like that. Yeah, it's tough because forcing timings is rough. So is events happening without the players being able to affect them when you want them to have the adventure. Though you could adapt this for other locations too. They could be hunting the killers of Varney's flats. But the point is, you know, there is some good advice there with these starting settlements, which really could be starting settlements. You just have to put the extra thought into them. That's some good stuff. And then, you know, a few bad things. The other bad thing I think I'd say is, and this is a systemic thing, is but just how often you're essentially meant to find stuff out by rolling dice, and if you don't get it, it's not necessarily a plot dead end. Occasionally it seems like it is, but how often it's just kind of a bit like, oh, okay. So for instance, gone to pieces, the first night there, blah blah blah, someone gets killed, blah blah blah. A hard TN9 search of the area turns up a torn piece of fabric fluttering from the window pane. A fair TN5 search of Paul's body turns up a letter sent to the lining of his vest, showing he's a Union spy. Using medicine aptitude or search plus potentially a medicine aptitude bonus to get forensic evidence of how the victim was killed. And you think, oh yeah, you know, that's the skill checks, that's so you can determine success. Except for some of those, I look at the window, is there anything on it? The DM says, there's a torn scrap of fabric. It's white fabric. That's how that should happen. There's a clue there that is gated behind a roll, which doesn't add anything meaningful to the gameplay, because the player, if they do not discover something, and in fact the bonus points on this, the banter points, sorry, are for discovering difficulty levels of clues, which is, there is a small push your luck thing where you could be spending chips to push your success. That is part of Deadlands, absolutely. But when you do not know the theoretical gains, what you might find and what you might therefore earn, and what it might lead to in terms of discovering the killer, you have no basis on which to make these decisions. It's bad design to gate stuff behind those rolls, so players, just give them the evidence. You let them do the detective work, and this is, you know, there's a 3-clue thing here as well, giving players different options for getting clues. Letting them fail, yes, but giving them different options for getting useful information. And I think Independence Day, which is the purest detective story, there's a bunch of detectoring in, well, both the others, but particularly in Night Train, but it's secondary. Whereas in Independence Day, a big reward is to be able to stop the butcher after only one murder, after he kills the spy. And that requires being able to get all this evidence. And so, you know, let the levels of success be determined by player skill rather than by character skill and luck, with a tiny bit of good decision making about white chips, blue chips, etc. But they could even not work. You know, you could be like, oh well, yeah, great. I spent my chips, but it improved my dice rolls by 1 or whatever. That's a weak mechanic, and that is something which happens throughout these adventures, is gating stuff behind, and it's worse in Independence Day, gating stuff behind dice rolls in a way that is not very interesting. I think there are, as I say, there are really great moments in all of them, not just good concepts, not just a few bits of good setup or execution, but some really good stuff. Like, I think the section searching the compound, the cult's compound here, is good. That is a strong section. Independence Day, I think the general idea of investigating the killing is good and has some good moments, but I think it gets dragged down a bit by some of that other stuff. And then Night Train, it is lacking a map of the train that you can guess how it's meant to be, and it literally describes the train in the Great Rail Wars scenario. But aside from that, the general sense of like, what's on the train? How do you get around the train? The risks of the train. The idea is, as a con scenario, you can see the lethality in this. This is a lethal scenario, probably above the curve on Deadlands. Deadlands is a deadly game. Well, this is probably above the curve. So I think yeah, the actual stuff once you're chasing the train, that's good. It's interesting again in terms of assumptions. The fiction includes a steam wagon and a mad scientist. The adventure assumes, well, look, if you're using horses, this is how it works. And I think that's easily fixed. But again, there's just a narrowness of player activity assumed. But yeah, there's also the fact you're trying to work out how to deal with these monsters, and working out how to fix monsters, deal with monsters, is definitely part of the Deadlands meta. It is in other RPGs. D&D is the most obvious one, but I think you definitely get it here. The idea that you might need to work out what is going on with this particular monster and therefore what might work. This one has less of that than some adventures where you're trying to find out how to deal with the big bad or whatever. But it has a bit of that. And yeah, that's fun. As I say, the setting in this one, Vining Flats, is probably the best of all of them. And the investigative sections, as here is a crime scene essentially in terms of both the Barlow station and the farm where the Marshal has gone missing. Marshal McBride's gone missing. Those are both very solid in terms of, it also matches some of that 2-clue mechanism or 3-clue mechanism of saying, look, here's different ways of getting some information. And there's different bits of information in each, you might not get all of it. And that's really strong again. So and of course, the bounty point thing is partly solved if the players know that's how they're going to get bounty points. Is, finding major clues is always worth 1 bounty point or something. But yeah, I think that's a good summary of where we're at, which is that basically Perdition's daughter starts strong and ends okay. You have to kind of be up for doing Deadlands combat in the end in these, fighting loads of vampires, fighting a witch and a bunch of crazed cult members, and a non-crazed gunslinger who's quite deadly, actually. That is one thing you again realise, like, the way that dice can work, or fighting an abomination. There's also a couple of potential brawls here. You're not meant to kill people when you're being a lawman on Independence Day. And there's a cool cursed artifact in that one too. So I think there's, there's always some good stuff, but you have to, as long as you're willing to get into that final battle, that's always going to be a flaw if you don't like that combat. I think the best executed is Night Train, and Night Train is also the one. I mean, what do they give you in the Deadlands? What, other than the particular pulp experience of I fought a cult, I fought an abomination, I fought vampires in a train. I think here you don't really get any contacts out of it necessarily. Maybe people escape. I don't know. Maybe the gunslinger escapes. This one, you get a sense of the reckoning as a whole. This is just dark magic. This is a bit of the reckoning as a whole, especially this witch was around before the reckoning. And so weird, crazy stuff happens, and maybe you can get some of that information off. In this case, it is off, I think, is it that there is another doctor who can tell you? Yes, there's a second doctor who can tell you about the butcher because they were at Gettysburg too. It's very convenient. That's actually not particularly strong. Yeah, that gives you some sense of the wider reckoning. Night Train, I think, has the great advantage, actually, that it can tie you into the Great Rail Wars, because By Verminion is behind the zombie engineer driving a train full of Nosferatu who kidnap whole towns on rival train lines to damage them and to make them less functional. That's something you could actually pick up and pursue, and that ties you into other stuff. Some aside notes, I can't really comment on the Great Rail Wars because, other than having read products and having looked at some of the cool figures and cards, I have not played it. But certainly, like, it reads nice, it reads functional, and it makes me much more interested in playing the game. I'm theoretical interest anyway, because I'm like, that sounds cool. Like the fact that this is, you could have your kung fu guy and your gunslinger and your cowgirl fighting them, and then you can rescue civilians to come and join your miniatures army, and there's a particular, like, effects in different areas, rules effects for magic and stuff. Yes, that's fun. In Independence Day, there is actually a so is this for the epitaph? No, this is for Rascals, Varmints and Critters. They're asking for you to send them in stuff for Rascals, Varmints and Critters, which was released in '97. You could even get up to $100 for winning cash prizes. So for kind of the top 3 entries, it was like cash prizes for the top 3 entries. And what they they give a sample, so it's just free, is the Lake Hellion, which is a big bloated misshapen shrimp is it in Salt Lake or something like that? It's in lakes near Salt Lake City, I think is the point. And yeah, it gives you a kind of posse facing thing about a rumour you could give them, and the stats, which are, I mean, they're pretty, they're not individually, they're 6 inches long, they're not massive, but just there's so many of them is the point. And they damage you with wind in a really annoying way, which you can't recover it except by waiting a long time. So kind of an interesting, different kind of monster. How far, again, you're going to have to put that into your Salt Lake campaign, and you're going to have to put it as one more. If you're having this in a freeform context rather than here's an encounter on the road, they have to do, which is also fine if that's what you're doing. Yeah, you know, it's a marginal monster, but a fun one. So yeah, just some nice bonuses. Anyway, that's what I thought of the adventures in the first 3 Dime novels. I'd love to know what you think, if you've read them or played them. Night Train, I know people will have played out there because of its convention game popularity. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'll see you next time.